everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a dog in pastels. Now this video is going to primarily focus on how to draw black fur. Now when drawing black fur, contrast is really important. This is something that I talk about in all of my videos, and I really want to be making sure with black fur that I've got it as dark as it needs to be. Now in some cases the black fur is going to be very reflective, so you're going to have some blues, purples, some browns even. It's going to very much depend on the reference photo. But no matter the pencils that are used, I still want to be making sure that I've got my lights and my darks accurate. Now what I'm focusing on here first of all is getting a good base foundation in place. You can see that I am using some of those warmer colours and occasionally a darker purple just to enhance the depth within the fur. I want to be making sure that I've got a good blended soft base layer because this makes it easier to add those details on top. Now when I start to build up the pencil details here, working with that initial layer of texture, you can see that I'm building up my values gradually. I'm not jumping to my lightest pencils first, I want to save those for my later layers. Now at times here I'm also going to go back in with my darker pencils. This is something that I do a lot pretty much with any fur texture that I draw. It's not strictly layering from dark to light. I might come back in with some darker pencils on top of my lighter layers just to maximise the depth and contrast. Now the depth and contrast is something that I really do focus on. I want to be making sure that I've got that as accurate as I can because I feel that it's that's going to make that portrait look more three-dimensional and realistic. It's not worrying about the exact colour that's going to increase that level of realism. Now the reason for me that I don't focus on the exact colour is because you can have 3 or 4 photos of that same animal and the colour on the fur looks different in every single one. That's going to vary depending on whether or not it's a sunny day, whether or not the photo was taken inside compared to outside. It is something that is going to be determined by many different factors, but the one thing there that is going to be very clear is the contrast. The fur will look darker in the shadowed areas and those highlights will be nice and bright. Now, of course, again, that is going to vary depending on the lighting and the way that the reference photo has been taken. You can end up with a reference photo that's very poorly lit, which would not be a good example to work from for a realistic drawing. But it is something where the contrast is going to have more of an impact rather than the colour. Now, the colour selection process is something that I do cover thoroughly in my real-time lessons. I want to be really focusing on how I can simplify that process as much as possible, and that's why I use a very simple colour wheel system for making it easier for knowing which pencils we should be using. Now if any of my real-time step-by-step lessons are of interest, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. But the colour selection process, it is something where I think we can overthink that aspect of the drawing. When we're working with selecting colours, there are probably, in this case with dark fur, you've got many different blues and purples that you could use. The Dark Purple in the Derwent range is one of my favourite purples for enhancing depth within black fur, but there are many other different examples of pencils that would work just as well. It's about picking whether or not that colour should be a light value or a dark value that's going to help maximise the realism of that drawing. And that's why I've got a range of different subjects on my tutorial platform where I can really emphasise which colour to use depending on the animal, the lighting, the fur texture and so on. Now the one thing here that's really apparent is how I like to break everything up into small manageable chunks. This for me is a way that I can work through an entire portrait without becoming overwhelmed or stressed. Now of course, depending on the texture, the complexity of that portrait, there are still going to be times where we can start to overthink that process. That's entirely normal. But if we work with a way that can cope with those feelings and we can break that up into those small sections and then the individual layers, we're more likely to be far more efficient with how we're working. Now if you are finding that you're looking at a reference photo and you're hesitating, you're not quite sure where you should be, that's an indication that you may potentially be looking at too much of a larger area. Now for me personally, if I try to work on one whole layer at one time, so I block in all of the base layer for the entire animal and then I do my second layer and so on, I do know that I start to rush and I cut corners. Now this is something that I of course want to avoid because that will show in the finished portrait. The depth and realism will be lacking. So for me personally and how I do like to work, I always want to be breaking up into smaller sections. The nose here, for example, nose texture and being able to capture that three-dimensional shape of where the nostrils curve over. If I don't break that up into individual sections and those layers and separate layers, I know that potentially that nose is going to look flatter and more two-dimensional, which of course is something that I want to avoid. So if I can break it up into those manageable chunks, I know that I'm able to sit at that easel and get the very best out of that layering process. Now for the fur on the muzzle, I think this is one of the more complex sections of most portraits. Now when you're working on breeds such as Labradors, German Shepherds, Springer Spaniels, the fur around the nose and on the muzzle area is significantly shorter. Whereas with breeds like this and other breeds, for example, such as a Cockapoo, the fur around the nose area is significantly longer than maybe the fur on the top of the head. So this is where we need to be adjusting the pencil technique. Now, pencil technique is something that I do focus very step-by-step thoroughly in all of my real-time tutorials because it really is a big factor in how realistic that fur is going to look. Now, there are 3 things that we need to consider regarding pencil technique when drawing fur. They are fur direction, fur length, and fur thickness. Now, the things that are going to be affected by that are the amount of pressure we're applying to the pencil, how we're holding the pencil and moving the pencil, the sharpness of the lead, and of course the layering process and how we are using those pencils throughout that drawing. Now, one of the first things that I mentioned there was the fur direction. Now, the fur direction, of course, is going to vary depending on the animal that we're drawing. Even the same breed, but different dogs are going to have a slightly different fur direction because that is influenced by the face structure. So if you have a Labrador, for example, that's got a little bit more of a longer nose, that there is going to affect the fur direction on the bridge of the nose compared to a Labrador that might have a slightly shorter nose. So this here is always something that we need to be paying very close attention to. The way that we are working with the fur direction, it's not random. So if we start to add details that are curving in different ways compared to what the reference photo shows, we can actually then add more structures under the skin. We can change the shape of the face. This is obviously something that we don't want to happen. We want to try to capture that reference photo as accurately as we can. So I want to be making sure that the fur direction is one of my main priorities. Now, when I work with my pencils for my base layers, as I am for this portrait, I didn't use any soft pastel sticks or pan pastels here. Even for my base layer stage, I'm making sure to follow the fur direction. Mainly so that this is good muscle memory. I already am studying that reference photo accurately right from that very first layer. There's never any scribble movements with that pencil because that can encourage a little bit more of a lazy approach throughout that layering process. That can then expand through to the other layers as we continue to work with the pencils. So I'm always looking to focus on the fur direction from that very first layer if I am using my pencils from start to finish. Now the second factor is the length of the fur. Now this of course is determined by how long that pencil is in contact with the paper for. This, just like the fur direction, is going to vary considerably depending on the animal that we're drawing. Now for this dog, obviously the fur around the muzzle is significantly longer than the fur on the top of the head, so I have had to make sure to lengthen my pencil strokes here considerably. I want to be studying whether or not the fur on the under layers is longer and whether or not the top layers and the finer details are shorter. Now in this situation here, we do have a couple of little hairs that are shorter on the top layers, so I do want to save those for my later layers. I don't want to be adding those in too soon, but it's about noticing that variation. Usually that one section of fur is not going to just be one length. You are going to have various lengths depending on the layer that you're drawing. Now onto the body, and this is where the fur thickness starts to come into account. Here I'm starting to group more of my pencil strokes together. I'm working with more of my blunter pencils. There's no need to sharpen them for this base layer stage, but I want to be making sure that I've hinted at where the fur is grouped together. So you can see here that I've got some of those darker clumps. I'm already hinting at a different texture compared to the fur on the face. Now the fur thickness and relating to how wide, how thin those finer details should be, this is going to have a dramatic influence on what that texture looks like. Now in some cases, when we start working with layers of detail, we have a tendency to try to make all of those details very narrow so they look nice and fine. But if you're working on a texture of the fur where it is a little bit more clumped together like this, then you want to avoid all of those finer details until potentially your last layer. Now, of course, again, this is going to vary depending on the reference photo, the animal that we're drawing. But if you do have fur that looks more grouped together, more clumped together, then we want to be making sure that we are not isolating one specific fur detail from the next. You want to try to pair a couple of those together. This is really going to help capture a little bit more of that different texture. Now for this last lower section of the chest, I'm using here a soft tool with a sponge on the end, and that's enabling me to apply a little bit of pan pastel to get that soft blended transition between the lower part of the chest and the background. You can of course achieve this with the pencils, but we have to be a little bit more cautious to make sure that those pencil strokes are not too harsh, because you want to still be able to blend those into that lower part of the background if you are trying to capture this faded effect. Now I prefer this look to my pet portraits where I am fading it out rather than just having a harsh edge at the lower part of the body. I just find that this being merged into the background creates a bit more of that natural softness that I like. But of course you do have another option where you can draw the dog all the way to the lower edge or the sides of the paper if you've got enough of that dog visible. In some cases the photo might be cropped, so that's not ideal, but if you do want to fade it out like this, then using the pan pastels and blending that into your background works really well. The pan pastels blend beautifully, so it's a really good use of them for something like this. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.